So I want to, like other speakers, thank the organizers for this invitation. I'm going to do something I think maybe just a little different. I'm going to talk about the National Database for Autism Research and tell you a little bit what that is. That's going to be the first part of the talk. And then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to disavow that I work at NIH, and I'm going to give you a bunch of opinions about data sharing efforts that I think have worked, because this is not all that new a subject, and there really are a number of communities that have succeeded in sharing data, and so try to talk a little bit about that. So starting with Endar, the National Database for Autism Research, we have a modest goal for this data infrastructure. We want to make all of the human subject research data related to autism spectrum disorders discoverable and available to the research community. Modest goal. The reason for this is that, as you know, ASD is a very heterogeneous disorder. And our feeling is that the only way to try to get some real traction on understanding this disorder is to aggregate data from everyone. It's an experiment, and it's not that old an experiment. I think we have some evidence that it's working, and that evidence is that there are papers that are being published using data only from the database, and the data infrastructure is being duplicated for other complex diseases, traumatic brain injury and Parkinson's, and it's available to anyone who wants it. If you're interested, let us know. But it's early, and I don't think we know yet whether this is really, how successful this approach is really going to be. So Endar is composed of a number of components. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data dictionary. I'm going to talk about the global unique identifier, the GUID. Talk a little bit about querying data. Talk about data federation, because we're not the only infrastructure that holds autism data. So how do you talk to each other? And then I'm going to talk about why sometimes it's good to be the federal government when you're making a data infrastructure. And then, as I said, we'll go to the more speculative parts of the talk. So Endar is a joint infrastructure by several institutes at NIH. I've highlighted NIEHS just to recognize that we do have some environmental data in the data infrastructure, although it's not a whole lot. It is, as I said, a federal repository. Contains data only from human subjects related to autism and control subjects. The data are available to anyone in the research community through a not too difficult application process, but it is an application process. You can't just log in and get the data directly. Summary data, though, are available to anyone with a browser. So if you get bored as I'm speaking, go to endar.nih.gov and you can start to navigate through, and I'll show you a little bit what those queries look like. I think that's critical. As you think about data infrastructures, it needs to be really easy for anyone to look and see what you have so that they know whether it's worth the effort to try to actually get access to the data. And that's something that we don't typically do a very good job of, in my experience. As I said, it's not all that old. It was begun in 2006, and the first data started rolling in 2008. We have demographic data, as you would expect, clinical assessments, many types of clinical assessments, imaging data, and omic data. Currently, we have about 37,000 people who have contributed data to the data infrastructure. And we have 150 terabytes of data, which is not insignificant. As we just heard, it's way too big to move around. So the data are stored in the cloud. I agree with Stephen, this is a painful thing for the federal government to figure out how to, for NIH to figure out how to do. We've done it. And we anticipate that all of our future development, sort of instantiating pipelines that will compute on that, will all be done in the cloud. And that's the only rational way to go, I think, at this point. So the data dictionary, it is one of the two key building blocks for the infrastructure. We have 400 instruments that are freely available to anyone. There's a variety of things that are in there, and I should say these are instruments that are defined by the users. As you'll see, NIH awardees need to deposit their data into this database, and so the data dictionaries come from those researchers. It accommodates any type of data or data structure. The important thing, as we've talked about earlier, is the curation, and this takes a lot of time and effort, but Endar staff spend an awful lot of time solving the MF10 type of mapping that you need to do from instrument to instrument in order to make a query work over all of these different types of data. The other thing that the data dictionary does that we haven't talked about yet, and I'll show you what I mean by this in a minute, is it allows investigators to quickly perform quality control checks. And this is really important. And I think to have simple ways for investigators to figure out, are the data where I expected them to be, and are the values consistent with what the data dictionary says they need to be? So here's an example of what our data dictionaries look like. Long list, you can search through them in a variety of ways. The individual records look like this. And what I was just talking about is here, before anyone can deposit their data into Endar, they have to run this software check at their home institution. And it looks to see in this field, do you only have 0, 1, 2, 3, or 8? If someone entered -1 one day to indicate that the instrument wasn't working quite right or that something funny happened, we won't take that data in until the data are made consistent with the data dictionary. And that's absolutely critical. We don't see all of those errors. We hear from people who've cleaned their data, and they're grateful that they have this tool. At least sometimes they're grateful. Sometimes they are not so grateful. But it really is important so that the users understand that once they can only put clean data, relatively clean data, into the infrastructure. We are not the only group at NIH. We had an example of this earlier with 14 standards going to 15 standards. That's one of my favorite cartoons as well. But NIH has set up a lot of different data dictionary types of efforts. I've listed a couple of the most, perhaps the most important ones. Just last week, a website went live. A group of us have been working on this. And I would encourage you to look at these controlled data elements, because in the environmental health sciences, there's a fair amount that exists already. There's no need for in my view, for NIEHS to think about, or anyone else to think about, standing up their new version of the data dictionary. All that probably really needs to be done is adding additional data elements to FENX or one of these other infrastructures that's already out there. So that's what I have to say about data dictionaries. Now, the other key feature, the other key component of Endar is the GUID, the Global Unique Identifier. Endar obviously holds information about human subjects. We're a federal repository. We have less than no desire to hold personally identifiable information. So how do you do that? Well, the way we've done it is we take some simple information from a birth certificate. The depositor takes some simple information from a birth certificate, uses software at their site, and generates an identifier. If that subject is seen at multiple laboratories, and if the people typing in the data are careful, the same GUID will be generated by those different laboratories. So it allows us to aggregate data from the same subject seen at multiple sites without ever knowing any of the personally identifiable information. So we are making this available to basically anyone who wants it. Other research communities have adopted it. And I think this is really critical in situations where you have the same subject who's likely to be seen at multiple sites. Okay, so here's what Endar looks like. I'm going to talk a little bit about querying. So when you go to the home page, you see some basic you know, breakouts of what our data look like. You can query, if you go to the query tab and go to any one of these tabs, you can get drop-down menus. You can query on a whole bunch of things. Just as an example, I put higher than average verbal IQ. You then hit show results. I'm too scared to do this, obviously. These are, you know, in real time, but you hit show results, and I should have pointed out, we have 25,000 males in the database. Higher IQ, we have 1,400. So this is what I was saying, that you know right away, do we have enough data to make it worthwhile for you to fill out a data access request and get data? In this case, many of those with higher IQs are controls, but not all of them. This wedge are folks on the spectrum. And if you needed information about 500 folks with ASD who were in that category, you'd know that we have something. Other ways that we allow the user to query are data associated with a particular lab. So this is an example of data that's come in from Susan Buchheimer's lab at UCLA. We do really believe in pretty deep federation. So if you click here on the project number, you'll go to the NIH databases that have information about that grant, how long it is, how much it is, you know, who's administering it, that sort of thing. You click here, you go to PubMed and get any of the papers that are available. Clicking here gets you to any of the data dictionaries, and you see, you know, how many folks have been deposited by this lab in the database. So, you know, if you have access to Endar and you hit the Endar button here, you will get all of Susan's data. If you really think she does great work, you can get only her data and analyze, you know, her data. We've done a similar sort of thing with papers. So there are a couple of these now that have been defined, but for these papers, you can click on the button and get all of the subjects that were part of that manuscript. So if you want to reanalyze the data using your own processing pipeline, it's trivial. You hit the button, you download the data, or you get access to it in the cloud, and you run it through your processing pipeline and see what happens. I'm really kind of excited about this idea. You know, I think this is going to be important, as we've talked about, for a variety of reasons. Data federation. All right, so when Endar got started, there were already several other data repositories that had significant human subjects data. What we have done, and there are 5 or 6 of these, is we've developed what I call deep federation. So that query that I showed you earlier is launched across all of these databases simultaneously. You don't know where that data are sitting, you just know that they're out there somewhere. When the researcher goes to get the data, they have, you know, here are for this particular person, here are the databases they have access to. If most of that data they were interested in was in ATP and they don't have access, they can click the button and apply for access. ATP controls who gets access to their data, but Endar surfaces the data so that you know that it's out there somewhere. It's not ideal. It can be a little clunky. If you need to get access to 6 independent data sets, databases, that takes some time. But it does respect everyone's consents and IRB issues, and seems to be a way to go in the environment that we now live in. Okay, so sometimes it is good to be the federal government. There are 2 points I wanted to make here. The first is that all of the institutes that work in the autism area have agreed, at NIH, have agreed that when they make an award on a grant that's going to generate data from human subjects, terms and conditions are inserted into the notice of grant award. Those terms and conditions are crystal clear that the data are going to be deposited in Endar, and it works, not unexpectedly. Sometimes it's good to have money, right? That's, also, I think that this isn't quite as well appreciated, but federal data repositories can have real advantages in making the data broadly available. if a database sits at an institution, as we've heard earlier, that institution can have real concerns about making human subjects data broadly available, because once it's out of the institution's control, how do they know that it's going to be treated responsibly? Our data access requests have to be signed by an institutional official. So the institution is then on the hook for making sure that those data are treated responsibly. That's really a good thing. Again, a little clunky, but it really serves a purpose, I think, with human subjects types of data. Okay, so I'm partway through the talk, and I'm going to take my badge off, and NIH has no responsibility for what I'm going to say now. I'm just going to give you some of my opinions about data sharing. I'm going to talk a little bit about researchers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about communities. So the first point to make is that human beings don't seem to have any trouble sharing data. In fact, I'm quite shocked looking at some of these sites, what gets shared, but it does. And, there are many of these sites that aren't all that easy to use, honestly, but people take a lot of time and effort to put their data into these sites. So we know that. Why is it that researchers don't necessarily have the same view towards sharing data? Well, I think there are a couple of reasons here, many of them legitimate, a couple maybe less so. Researchers have concerns about people taking their data and doing something incorrect with it, not really understanding what they did, analyzing it in a new way, and then getting a different result. And so the original researcher who measures the data is now involved in some sort of battle in the literature. As I said, data sharing takes effort, and it might require that the researcher do something different. And it requires a data sharing infrastructure. As we've heard before, researchers receive very little credit for sharing their data. Keeping data, if you're a researcher and you've measured the key data set and you don't let anyone else have access to that data set, you have an obvious competitive advantage. And that is important, especially in these funding times. And finally, as we've also talked about a little bit, many researchers see little value in taking data from others. They just don't believe that anyone does it as well as I do. So I have some sort of, comments about these concerns. So, it's certainly true that reanalysis can be messy, but ultimately the community as a whole, including both halves of this argument, really do benefit, because what almost always happens is you end up somewhere in the middle. Both folks realize that there's value in the other approach, and the community as a whole figures out, it grows from this experience, even though it may not be a lot of fun as you're going through it. Data sharing does require effort, and I think this is a real concern. It requires funds from, to do this right. At the Endar website, we have a little estimator where you can go and put in what sort of data do you have, and we tell you how much you should ask for in your NIH grant to get that data into Endar. It's actually not a lot of money, but it's not zero, and that's important. The infrastructure is something else that I think is underappreciated. NIH spends a lot of money on research, justifiably. I don't think we spend enough on infrastructure. And I think in many cases now, the infrastructure is the key missing ingredient. As I look at NIH's big data efforts coming down the pike, obviously we still need to do research, but I think we really need to invest in some infrastructure like Endar. Now, of course, I have a vested interest, but I think that the infrastructure is often a missing piece here, and that without that, it's hard to share data. It's much harder to share data if you don't have somewhere to put it. Researchers receive little credit for sharing data. Boy, isn't that true. And it's because we don't, getting back to infrastructure, we don't have a great infrastructure yet to give that credit. I think that infrastructure is coming. We've heard about efforts this morning. I think this digital object identifier could end up being the critical piece that we need in order to allow tracking of how often data are used, so that we would have a single site to go to, and that promotion and tenure committees and NIH review panels and others can figure out, was that data ever used by anyone for anything meaningful? The data by papers that I showed you is another way that could accommodate something like that. We will be tracking how often are those data downloaded from papers. Keeping data, if you don't share your data, you have a competitive advantage. Well, this is certainly true, but I kind of think NIH has gotten to the point where the painful funding climate, along with the relatively slow appearance of cures for complex diseases, and our never-ending promises to Congress that the cure is just around the corner, as we heard this morning, not to mention the reproducibility issues that have come up in the past year or so, really means that this has to change. We really have to have this cultural change. And finally, many researchers see little value in data from others, and that does change. And as an example, I want to talk for a minute about what happened in X-ray crystallography. So before I came to NIH, I was a crystallographer. There's an interesting case study here. For small molecules, small molecules, drug-sized molecules, everyone forever, basically, has shared their data in the Cambridge database. And in fact, you can't get papers published without sharing the data. And this is an incredibly high-quality data infrastructure. What they do is you send them your intensities, your raw measurements. They resolve your structure. God help you if you have the labels wrong on your hydrogens or your bond angles aren't quite right. But they do a very, very high-quality curation, and the data that sit in this database are impeccable. You don't think about it. You just go and you get it, and it's right. It's always right. For biological macromolecules, there was an interesting early decision or group in the community that really started to share early on. So remember the first structure, myoglobin, 1958. By 1970, the folks at Brookhaven had developed tools that allowed sharing and some computation on the structures that were available. There weren't a lot of structures available at that point, but you could do something with them. In the late 80s, the journals and NIH, I think independently, I've never been able to uncover just how much coordination there was, began to require that coordinates be deposited in the protein data bank. There was a driving force for that, which was a very important structure was solved, and those coordinates weren't shared, and it drove everyone nuts. And NIH basically said, never again. And I think the journals felt the same way. And then in the 90s, really interesting things started to happen because all of a sudden there were a lot of there was a lot of structures in the database. And so quality control became possible simply because when you have 10,000, 20,000 structures, you know what a bond angle should be. And you know that if you have a deviation from that bond length, bond angle, whatever, that either there's a mistake or there's really interesting science going on. So right now there are more than 87,000 structures in the data bank. The manufacturers have gotten to the point where in their software, they write the output files that go straight to the PDB. So the community, if you're a member of this community and you don't want to share your data, you really have to work at it. I mean, it's really hard not to share your data. The files are right there. All you need to do is put them in an email and send them in, basically. And I think the key feature for me in terms of quality of a data infrastructure is that in the 90s, computational crystallographers emerged as a legitimate part of the community. These are people who don't do experiments in the lab. They don't grow crystals. They're purely work on the database, and that's now recognized as a valuable part of the community. So longer term, how do you know when databases are working? That's how you know when databases, really are working. I think that there are other communities that have gone through similar steps, protein sequences, nucleic acid sequences. We heard about worm base earlier today. I think fly base may belong in this camp as well. I think there are some interesting characteristics that come up over and over again in the study of these successful databases. Often there's a key person or a small number who are going to aggregate data regardless of whether anyone else thinks it's a good idea or not. It's often true that the experiment is hard to duplicate early on, and so the database provides access to that information to a wider community. It's also interesting to know that the data infrastructure often migrates. Often the folks who start it have a certain set of skills. Those aren't the same skills that you need for long-term maintenance necessarily. So sometimes it's stable. Often it moves around a little bit, and that's not a problem as long as the database has been set up appropriately. And I think the other thing to remember is that early incarnations often aren't really all that useful. It's often only true that after 10, 12, 15 years that you have something that's really worth having. It's a little painful to make the investment up front and not know for 15 years whether that was going to be good. But sometimes I think that really is necessary. I have a request that I know of one case where a data infrastructure was relatively well funded, where everything I thought should have worked and it didn't. So I only have an N of 1. I'm looking for others because I wonder if there isn't a similar list that could be made for those infrastructures that aren't successful, and maybe that would help the government and other funders really start to understand how to measure goodness, what to look for when you're setting one of these things up, what to worry about in a shorter period of time than 15 or 20 years. So if folks know of anything, please let me know. And finally, I wanted to talk about, this is a badly titled slide, but I wanted to talk about a fear that often occurs, and that I think is well described by what Mike Millam and company have done with the 1,000 functional connectomes. So I think most folks in the functional MRI field believe that their data can't be aggregated. The pulse sequences are different. The experimental conditions are dramatically different. Lights on, lights off, eyes open, eyes closed. Different manufacturers, they throw up their hands and they say, there is no way that aggregating this data can ever have any value. Therefore, I'm not going to bother to share because it's useless. Well, Millam was one of these visionary folks, and he said, let's see. And so he got data from 12, 15 labs, significant data, hundreds of images, and he aggregated them. And amazingly, there is real overlap. It turns out that the resting state networks that are observed in one laboratory are observed in all of these data. Despite the fact that the experiment is dramatically different in different labs. So, I really do have, perhaps I'm just naive, but I really do think that there's probably value in aggregating almost anything. It's not necessarily going to be true that a community has to agree on this, this central overlap issue. But by putting all this together, I kind of have a feeling that what you generally do is you take these areas and you draw them into that pink circle, or at least into these areas where 2 or 3 or 4 or 12 investigators can legitimately agree on how to do experiments and what they really mean. So I do want to thank all the folks who've been associated with the Endar project for a long time. I have a large group. They're great. And I will be happy to answer questions.